The sacred secrets and the significance of the best room, the parlour, in the post-war lives of black British families. BBC4 presents Tales from the Front Room.
I hear the sound of distant drums.
For us as children, the front room was a big people room, an adult room. You knew that you went in there, you had to treat it as special. In West Indian households, you sat there and you conversed, and nothing untoward mess happened in there, nothing vulgar or nasty or embarrassing.
And the only time you would get into that front room was when a family friend came round. They'd go into the front room and my mum would give us that look like, you're still not getting in here. And I think, you know what, we're going to get in that room. If it's the last thing, we're going to get in that room.
Every item, I think, in there represented a lot of hours of graft to get the money to go and buy those things.
We've tended to take the front room for granted and even to be a bit embarrassed by it and seeing it as rather kitsch and over the top.
But it's part of my history, and it's part of Caribbean people's history, and therefore it's part of Britain's history, and it's a part of Britain's history which is barely acknowledged, if at all.
You know, when we came here in the 50s, the world wasn't as small as it is now. Arriving here was like going to the moon.
Nearly 500,000 immigrants from the Caribbean arrived in England during the 50s and 60s. Their first impressions of their new home were far from what they'd expected.
It was like one of those sort of old 1940s, 50s sort of Pathé movie scenes with lots of smoke coming out of chimneys.
It was strange being in a city in which the houses were a sort of immense row. One brick building which seemed to be arbitrarily divided in some way. You had this weird sense of the people going in and out like ants, because there were so many of them and so many buildings that looked exactly the same.
Everybody lived not only next to each other, but literally attached to each other. And I thought, wow, the neighbours are literally in our house, so to speak.
Just about every house in the Caribbean is a detached house. People like to have their sense of privacy and space. You know, even in a shanty town, you won't have shanty shacks built on top of each other. You know, there's always got to be a bit of space. You've got to have your own little bit of land. And the idea of a terraced house seems so alien to the culture I was used to.
Asked a woman for a lodging, she looked me in the eye, pointed to a little notice, no colours need apply.
The vast numbers of Caribbeans looking for housing either had doors slammed in their faces or were charged extortionate rents by opportunist landlords. That meant they could only afford the tiniest spaces wherever they could find them.
Housing conditions for my parents were cramped and poor. You have to remember, after the Second World War, there wasn't a lot of housing stock here left. And so they faced a situation where they had to live in one room.
The room was small, with a small bed, a table and a chair. We have to use that bedroom for everything. We had to use it for a front room, that if anybody should visit us, we have to take them in the corner chair and the table to have something to eat.
There was a sink and a little table with a little heater.
That was where we wash ourselves up, we wash our clothes and dry it on the paraffin heater. Cooking facilities, washing facilities were shared.
And I think particularly for my mother, she found that very difficult because she then had to negotiate with other women. And that could be a source of tension and arguments.
And it was pretty difficult at times, but people managed because they knew that it was part of the journey, as it were, and it wouldn't be forever.
After all, they couldn't really go back home. Their families had sent them here to the land of opportunity. This was the mother country, the land paved with gold, the land of milk and honey. So they couldn't explain all of the struggles that went on, so they just had to get on with it.
Here we are, thousands of miles away from home. Many of us have never left before, many of us with no relatives. We need a base somewhere. You might even call, I believe the word is anchorage.
My landlady too rude, in my affair she like to intrude. My landlady too rude, in my affair she like to intrude.
But it wasn't just landladies making things difficult for the Caribbeans in Britain. By the 60s, after years of saving and thrift, some were finally able to buy their own houses, only to be confronted with a housing market that was wary, to say the least.
Good afternoon or good morning, I said. I'm telephoning about the house. Oh, yes, dear. Can you please tell me about it? What's it like? And she told me, yes, 3 bedrooms near the shops, near the parks, near the schools, blah, blah, blah. And I said, sounds like what we're looking for. And she said, and by the way, dear, you'd be very glad to know there isn't a black for miles around.
How would you like it if a house next door to you was taken by a coloured person and became filled to bursting point with all his relations and his friends and so on and so forth?
I mean, we grew up in Wolverhampton. Our local MP was Enoch Powell. So you can imagine what the environment was like.
On the first week we were there, Saturday morning, we did the washing. I said to my husband, can you please hang the washing out? And he went outside in the garden with the basket full of washing. And the neighbour was hanging out her washing. She looked over the fence, took one look at him, dropped her basket of washing and ran into the house.
Home took on a sort of, I guess, a kind of a sanctuary, or kind of like a protective thing that perhaps now as an adult it doesn't have that same representation. But at the time it was almost like a physical sanctuary as well. It's a place where you actually felt you were physically safe, because you never knew what was going to happen out on the street at that time.
When I was about 10, my family moved from High Wycombe to London for better opportunities.
And it seemed like a big adventure, and the house seemed huge.
And certainly for the first time, we had a front room, which wasn't the bedroom, and where you didn't have suitcases planked on top of the wardrobe.
One moment it was bare floorboards and bare walls, and the next moment in my memory it was this ornate, fragrant, spotlessly clean place that I could only visit under parental supervision, generally either on Sundays after church or when big people came to visit.
What is, I think, amazing is that many of these houses, as you can imagine, that West Indian families at this stage could afford, are very small. But they still designate a space which is not packed out with people, and where there are distinct rules as to when the whole